And now we're moving on to the next portion of today's presentation, which is the moot. So in this moot, Little Red Riding Hood has been charged with wrongful death after killing the big bad wolf. And there's a dispute as to whether or not she should be found guilty, considering the fact that the big bad wolf attempted to eat her and her grandmother, and another party, the hunter, actually contributed to the wolf's injuries by cutting its stomach. So what you'll be witnessing is, firstly, a cross-examination of the Little Red Riding Hood and the hunter, and a submission by both the defense counsel and the prosecution to decide whether or not Little Red Riding Hood should be charged with wrongful death. I'll be acting as the defense counsel for Little Red Riding Hood, and Kai will be acting as the prosecution, and Mavis, Zephan, and Vijay will be the judges for today. And we kindly ask that you keep all your microphones muted during the session so that we minimize disruptions. And enjoy the show.
The court is in session and we are now proceeding to examine witnesses. Prosecution, you may go ahead with the cross-examination of the witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Red, I will now ask you a series of questions regarding the evidence that you just gave to this court. You need not elaborate. If you want to elaborate, you may do so later during your re-examination. At the end, I will put my case to you, and you can agree or disagree. Do you understand?
Yes.
Okay, Your Honor. I will now proceed with a series of questions relating to the accused's actions around the time of the incident.
All right, counsel, please proceed.
Much obliged, Your Honor. Red, you told this court that when you realized your grandmother had been eaten by a wolf, you got angry. Yes?
I mean, isn't that what is normal? What would you do if someone came and ate you?
Red, this isn't how a cross-examination works. I ask the questions and you simply deliver the answers. I just need a simple answer, yes or no.
Yes.
You were so angry that you were kicking and pounding on the inside of Wolf's stomach, yes?
Yes.
And when Hunter pulled both you and your grandmother from Wolf's stomach, you saw your grandmother, yes?
Yes.
Your grandmother was motionless, yes?
I don't know. All I could think of was how rotten and evil Wolf must have been.
Just a simple yes or no answer, right? Did you see your grandmother move?
No.
And when you exited the stomach, you were still angry, yes?
Yes, but I wasn't so angry that I would kill the wolf.
Did you see the wolf?
Yes, he was sitting there.
And he was motionless, yes?
Well, I didn't see clearly.
Just a yes or no answer will do, Red.
Yes, I think he was motionless.
Thank you. Red, earlier you told this court that when Hunter cut you from Wolf's stomach, and as you exited the stomach, you could see that you were in your grandmother's house, yes?
I wasn't really paying attention to my surroundings. I was dazed. I just got rescued from his stomach.
Right, let me paint you a picture here, Red. You are out of the stomach, and you look at Wolf lying there, and I reiterate that you didn't see him move. At the time, Hunter was right next to you, yes?
Yes.
So Wolf was clearly of no threat to you or your grandmother, yes?
No, he could have woken up.
He could have woken up. So when you gathered rocks to put into Wolf's stomach, you wanted to make sure that he couldn't move after that, yes?
Yes.
And you wanted to protect your grandmother, yes?
Yes.
And you wanted to incapacitate him, yes?
I wouldn't use the word incapacitate. I just wanted to stop him.
But just a couple of seconds ago, you said that you wanted to make sure that he couldn't move. Now you're saying that you didn't want to incapacitate him. Are you denying it?
It depends on your definition of the word incapacitate.
No, your definition, right?
Then my answer is no.
Your Honor, I will leave this to submissions. Red, as you were cut out of Wolf's stomach, you knew that your grandmother had been eaten by Wolf, yes?
Yes.
But you wanted to gather so many rocks that you could have stopped Wolf from moving, yes?
Yes.
And you cannot tell this court how many rocks you used, yes?
Yes.
And you cannot tell this court the weight of the rocks that you used, yes?
How was I to know? It all happened so fast. I just wanted to stop him from moving. It was self-defense.
And Hunter did not help you with these rocks, yes?
No, he did not.
I will put my case to you now, Rit. Earlier, I put my suggestion to you that you cared for your grandmother deeply, and you agreed, yes?
Yes, that's what I said.
And you're not changing your mind now, correct?
No, I'm not.
I put it to you that you are protective of your grandmother.
Yes, of
Yes or
course.
no?
Of
I put it
course.
to you that when you saw your grandmother in the wolf's stomach, you got angry, agreed?
Yes.
And I put it to you that when you tried to kick your way out of wolf's stomach to no avail, you got angrier, agreed?
Not exactly.
I will address this in submissions, Your Honor. Rit, you wanted to protect your grandmother from wolf, agreed?
Yes, but I didn't want to kill him.
I put it to you that you wanted to make sure that wolf could not hurt her again, agreed?
Well, not exactly. I wanted to stop him from moving.
And earlier you said that you did not see wolf moving after you exited the stomach, correct?
Yes.
And earlier you said that you saw Hunter nearby after you exited the stomach, correct?
Yes.
Red, I put it to you that since you did not see wolf moving, he posed no threat to you or your grandmother, agreed?
No, he could have woken up.
Red, Hunter was standing right beside you. I put it to you that even if he had woken up, he posed no danger to you or your grandmother. Agree or disagree?
Disagree.
Red, I put it to you that you put the rocks into Wolf, knowing that the rocks were heavy enough to ensure that he could not move. Red, earlier you agreed that you wanted to make sure that he did not move. Are you changing your mind now?
No.
So you agree that you put the rocks, knowing that they were heavy enough to prevent him from moving.
Yes.
I put it to you that in putting such heavy rocks into Wolf, you intended to incapacitate him in the long term. Agree?
I disagree.
I put it to you that in putting such heavy rocks into Wolf's stomach, you intended to kill him. Agree?
I disagree.
Your Honor, I will follow up the disagreements by written submissions. No further questions. Thank you.
The defense may now go ahead with your re-examination of the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Red, earlier the prosecution put it to you that you put the rocks into the wolf's stomach and intended to incapacitate him. You disagreed. Can you explain why?
Well, yes, it's because the prosecution is not understanding me. I just wanted to slow him down, to put something in him so he thought he was full and couldn't move.
You said thought that he was full. So you're saying that you wanted to?
Objection, Your Honor. Leading question.
I'll hear the remainder of the question.
I'll rephrase. Red, you said that you wanted him to think that he was full. Can you elaborate on this point?
I mean, since he was asleep, I wanted him not to suspect that my grandmother and I had escaped. So I put the rocks inside of him so that he could not chase us.
All right, the defense may begin cross-examination of the Huntsman.
Yes, Your Honor. Huntsman, I will now ask you a series of questions regarding the expert report that you submitted to the court. In the interest of time, you can respond with either a yes or a no. If you wish to elaborate, you may do so during the re-examination. Do you understand?
Yeah, sure.
In your medical report, you claim that placing rocks in the wolf's stomach was likely to cause death, correct?
Yes, absolutely. The rocks were too heavy, so the wolf's internal systems would definitely collapse.
And supposedly you have the medical expertise to make such a bold statement?
Yeah, of course. With my training as a hunter, I was the top of my cohort at the Hunter Cadet School.
Your experience, you say. So you've never actually killed a wolf?
I have killed several in simulations.
But never a real full-blooded wolf?
Well,
Hunter, please answer the question.
no, I have not.
Have you ever killed a wolf by placing rocks in its stomach?
To be honest, no, I have not.
In fact, have you ever killed a wolf by placing any object whatsoever in its stomach?
Not really.
Have you ever heard of anyone killing a wolf by placing an object in its stomach?
No, I guess not.
I put it to you that your experience as a hunter does not make you a credible expert on killing wolves by placing things in its stomach.
I mean, I guess I agree, but actually, it's not just my experience as a hunter. In university, I learned about wolf anatomy as well.
Ah, so you studied medicine?
No, but while I was at HTS, I did take an external course at a university where they taught us how to kill wolves effectively. They taught us the weak spots of wolves, which includes the stomach.
Huntsman, you mentioned that in the university you learned the weak spots of wolves. So specifically, you learned that you should attack wolves in the stomach area with your gun or your knife, correct?
That's correct.
So actually, doesn't that mean that the wolf was likely to have died from the slit wounds in his stomach that you inflicted, and not the rocks that Little Red Riding Hood placed there?
It's certainly possible that the wolf died from the slit wounds, but that doesn't change the fact that both the slit wounds and the rocks in his stomach were likely causes of death.
Thank you. And moving on, while university may have taught you that the stomach was a weak spot, you did not learn the complete anatomy of the wolf's stomach, correct?
That is correct.
So the truth is that you did not learn about the size or weight of objects that the wolf's stomach can withstand.
Not that I recall.
I put it to you that while you may have some expert knowledge on wolf anatomy in terms of their weak spots, you do not have any specific expertise on whether a wolf can or cannot die from only having rocks in its stomach.
I guess so, but it's somewhat related to what I learned in university.
I suppose that makes you only a somewhat credible expert.
Objection, Your Honor.
Withdrawn. No further questions, Your Honor.
Your Honor, may I commence the examination of the Huntsman, please?
Yes, please proceed.
Huntsman, early on, defense counsel tried to cast doubt on your credibility. Can you explain to this court why you were so sure that placing rocks in a wolf's stomach is likely to cause death?
It's simple, really. Rocks simply cannot be digested and they're too big to be passed out. Because of this, there is no room for doubt that the wolf would eventually starve to death.
Thank you, Huntsman. Can you tell us what makes you a credible witness so that you should believe your claims?
Well, first of all, I have a lot of experience about wolves. I observed that wolves have small stomachs. That is why when I aim for the wolf's stomach with my gun, I must aim carefully because the target is small. Secondly, while I did not learn about killing wolves with rocks in university, I did learn that wolves cannot digest hard objects. Thus, I am absolutely sure that placing rocks in a wolf's stomach is likely to cause death.
Thank you, Huntsman. No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsels, for the examinations and witnesses for your honesty to the court. We will now hear counsels for their submissions. Defense, your submissions, please.
May it please the court, my name is Vivien Tan, and I'm counsel for the defendant, Little Red Riding Hood. The case before this honorable court today is one of self-defense. It is a case where a young girl has been forced to take drastic measures to ensure the safety of not just herself, but that of her grandmother. The defendant, Little Red Riding Hood, has been a victim of an egregious crime. The prosecution seeks to find Little Red Riding Hood liable for the very crime that was almost committed against her. The breaking into and subsequent eating of grandparents and little children is definitely unacceptable and very illegal in fairyland. To charge the victim in this scenario for the crime that the aggressor had attempted would be inherently unjust. In this honorable court of fairyland, I will be addressing Little Red Riding Hood's position on the charge of wrongful death. The defense has three main submissions. First, that it was not true that she had any intention of causing death to the big bad wolf. Second, even if she had such intention, there would be serious issues of forming a clear link in causation between her actions and the wolf's death, due to the hunter's actions forming the dominant cause of the injury. Third, should the charge of wrongful death be made out in the end, the defense of own fault would apply, because the entire chain of events was started by the wolf's illegal act of eating Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother. For my first submission, I will be discussing the issue of intention. For Little Red Riding Hood to be guilty under the charge of wrongful death, she must be found to have the intention of causing death to the big bad wolf, or the intention of causing bodily injury that is likely to cause death. Little Red Riding Hood did not intend to cause death to the wolf. Her act of placing stones into the wolf's stomach was one of self-defense.
Counsel, how are you sure that Miss Red had no intention of causing death? If it was merely just an act of self-defense, as you say, there are other less violent ways of restricting the wolf's movement. This act of placing stones in its belly is not a simple task that can be done in the heat of the moment. It would actually require calculated actions in order to properly fill the wolf's stomach with stones. Are you saying that throughout the entire time, Little Red had no intention of causing a fatal injury as she piled stone after stone?
Your Honor, I understand your concern. However, from the perspective of Little Red Riding Hood, she had to be sure that the wolf would be guaranteed to be immobilized to prevent any possible pursuit of both her and her grandmother, which would result in the possible death of both of them.
Counsel, let me stop you there. This court determines intention by considering various factors, and that includes the amount of violence used, nature of the weapon, the part of the body, vital or otherwise, and where the wound was inflicted, and the effect produced. You see, your client stuffed the diseased stomach with more than 90 kilograms of stones, and that's a task that would take a child her size some considerable time. And yet, are you seriously telling this court that your client had no intention to kill or cause injury likely to cause death?
Your Honor, thank you for the question. While the weight of the stones was indeed large, my client's intention was not to cause death or even injury likely to cause death. My client was distressed, mortified, and wanted nothing more than to escape. Hence, she simply thought to place as many stones as she could to weigh the wolf down. It could be true that there are less violent ways of restricting the wolf's movement, but in the heat of the moment, it is very reasonable that a child such as Little Red Riding Hood would prioritize her own safety first and attempt to guarantee the immobilization of the wolf. Little Red Riding Hood's main goal was to immobilize the wolf and prevent pursuit. She could not have known that her act would cause the wolf to die, and hence could not have intended to cause such injury that would be likely to cause death. If Little Red had truly wanted the wolf dead, there would be other better ways to deal the final blow when the wolf was unconscious. If that satisfies your honor, I will now move on to my second argument on the issue of causation. Little Red Riding Hood's action of placing rocks in the wolf's belly was not the main cause of the wolf's death. This is because without either the wolf's own malicious actions or the hunter's actions of slicing and skinning the wolf would still be alive. The authority for this case is in Jack and Jill, where the highest court of Fairyland looked at 4 factors to determine if an action was the main cause of an outcome. Taken as a whole, Little Red Riding Hood's actions can clearly be made out not to be the dominant cause. It is our submission that the hunter's slit across the stomach was a greater contribution to the death of the wolf rather than my client's act of putting stones inside the wolf's stomach. While the weight of the stones was indeed very heavy, the reason why the wolf would have died eventually is due to the extreme weakness and blood loss from the hunter's cut. Wolves are extremely powerful creatures and would have been able to sustain the 90 kg weight long enough to seek treatment. However, because the hunter, on his own evidence, admitted to cutting the wolf across the stomach and led to excessive hemorrhaging, the wolf's death was inevitable from that point.
Counsel, I hope you see why we don't appreciate the logic of that argument. The case of Jack and Jill explicitly states that mathematical detail must be provided when considering the causation issue. Now, you've provided this court with nothing more than off-chance odds. The hunter's testimony was that both causes were equally likely to cause death, and that gives your client a 50% chance at best.
Your Honor, I understand your concern, but we respectfully submit that Jack and Jill must be taken in its entirety. The court ruled that causation can also be judged by where it would be a precondition or precursor to other causes. Little Red Riding Hood's action was not the dominant cause, because the wolf's malicious act of eating her and going after her grandmother was the precondition for Little Red Riding Hood's act of self-defense. Our final submission, Your Honors, is that in the alternative, we pray that this court will recognize the defense of own fault that should be applied to the malicious and illegal actions of the wolf. The own fault defense in Fairyland is deeply rooted in historical precedent and rationale. In the seminal case of High Witch and Mouse Boy, creating potions was illegal in fairyland. Although the boy turned the witch into a rat, it was the witch who had created the potion in the first place. She had intended to carry out the illegal transfiguration of the boy. The boy's subsequent action was found to be an act in response to the witch, and it was the witch's own fault that led to her own demise. Likewise, in our case, Little Red Riding Hood's admittedly illegal act of putting stones was an act of reaction, and it was a consequence to the initially illegal act of the wolf who had tried to devour both her and her grandmother.
Counsel, then if I may, if we are assuming that Little Red had the intention to murder, then the only person doing an illegal act here is her. The wolf is doing what a reasonable wolf would have done, is he not? He was simply trying to get dinner. A wolf is naturally predatory and the forest is his domain. The case of Mowgli tells us that Little Red should be careful because she's in the jungle after all. For careless humans not to pay attention and wander into the territory of the wolf, the fault for being eaten must then surely lie with them, would it not?
Your Honor, the wolf may be allowed to act as a reasonable wolf, but this does not mean that his actions should be free from consequence. A reasonable wolf may have gotten hungry, but a reasonable wolf would also then have gone to a simple restaurant to eat his fill. Fairyland is a civilized place, Your Honor, and condoning predators jumping on young girls in the woods would only set a dangerous precedent for this country. What the wolf did should not be considered reasonable at all. He confronted a young girl in the woods, extracted her from her location and her grandmother, and then proceeded to swallow both of them whole. This is illegal, and in itself is a charge of wrongful death had the hunter not intervened. This is not a case of negligence, as it was in Mowgli. This is a carefully planned setup by a deceitful wolf in order to devour a grandmother and her granddaughter. If Your Honors have no further questions, I rest my case.
We thank the defense counsel for her submissions. Prosecution, please.
Please the court. My name is Kai Gosian and I act for the prosecution. The case before us today is not one of self-defense. It is one of voluntary and calculated murder. The circumstances of the case involves Ms. Red's deplorable act of unnecessary cruelty brought upon the unconscious wolf, who was in no position to negotiate, escape, or fight back. Unconscious, the wolf had rock after rock deposited into his abdominal area right after having his stomach violently slashed open. The total amount of rocks tallied to 60 pieces, which had to be placed by hand, piece by piece, into the wolf's stomach. As expected, this caused considerable damage and wounds to the wolf's internal organs. Without a doubt, the wolf's chances of survival would be higher if he had not had 60 rocks inside of him. The defendant claims that this was an act of self-defense, but no act of self-defense should feature such levels of horrific cruelty. The accused had intentionally and willingly found and placed large rocks into Mr. Wolf's stomach. This was not only a completely unnecessary course of action to take, but it was an unspeakably cruel one as well.
Sorry, counsel, you mention it as unnecessary. However, the defense claims that Ms. Red was simply trying to guarantee her own safety. This is a reasonable explanation to me and would really suggest that Ms. Red was not motivated by malice, but by fear due to the position that the wolf had placed her in. Would you not think so?
Certainly, Your Honor. But it's important to note that the victim was unconscious and bleeding from the slit in his stomach. He would have been in no position to pursue Ms. Red. When Ms. Red made the decision to pile rocks into his stomach, she was never in any danger. Ms. Red may be entitled to care for her own safety, but she was not entitled to do it in such a violent manner that is unnecessary.
All right, counsel, please continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Today, I will explain why the accused should be found guilty for the charge of causing the wrongful death of Mr. Wolf. To this extent, I will be discussing two issues. The first issue is that of intention. I submit that Ms. Red had intended to cause the wolf's death, or at the very least, had intended to cause a bodily injury to the wolf that was likely to cause death. The second issue will be on the own fault defense. The own fault defense should not apply. Your Honor, the first submission I will make today is that Little Red Riding Hood did intend to cause death, or at least intended a bodily injury that is likely to cause death when she placed the stones in Mr. Wolf's belly. As we know, the crime of wrongful death applies where the accused intended to cause the death of another person or such bodily injury as was likely to cause death, and does an act in furtherance of that intention, which either directly or indirectly leads to the death of that other person. Your Honor, Ms. Red has shown clear intention of causing death by putting 60 rocks in the wolf's stomach. Anyone would know that such rocks could not have been digested and would definitely cause serious harm to the person. With the time it would have taken to methodically place all 60 rocks into Mr. Wolf's stomach, it is clear evidence of a calculated move by Ms. Red to orchestrate the death of the wolf.
Well, prosecution, I have one doubt. How can we conclude that Ms. Red knows or ought to know that placement of such rocks is likely to cause the death of the wolf? The defense raised the fair point that wolves are strong creatures, and while 90 kilograms of rocks can completely incapacitate a human, a wolf is strong enough to get help even under such duress. Counsel, explain to this court how Ms. Red has the necessary mens rea, the mental element.
Certainly, Your Honor. Where someone in Ms. Red's position knows that such an act is likely to cause death to a human being, it is only reasonable that they consider a similar consequence on the wolf and exercise due judgment. This is especially so given the comparable sizes of the human body and that of the wolf. Specific knowledge of the anatomy of the affected organism should not be required by case law.
Prosecution, are you telling this court that it cannot create new precedents?
Certainly not, Your Honors. This Honourable High Court has the complete authority to develop the law in the ways that your wisdom sees fit. I humbly and respectfully submit to Your Honours that such a development in the law would be undesirable. In fact, it will lead to public policy harms, as poachers can abuse this law. However, failing that, Your Honours, Ms. Red had very much intended to cause such bodily injury and wounds caused by the rocks, because as the defense has mentioned, Ms. Red wanted to prevent the wolf from coming after her. To do so, she had chosen to use 60 rocks, which would incapacitate the wolf through wounding him seriously. These wounds have been shown to be sufficient and thus likely to cause the death of the wolf, and Ms. Red thus amply fulfills the requirement for the charge of wrongful death.
All right, counsel, assuming we are with you on the issue of intention, what's your response to the defense counsel's position that there was no clear causative link, especially since the medical report has shown that both the injuries caused by the slit and the rocks were equally sufficient to cause death?
Certainly, Your Honor. The element of causation laid out in the case of Jack and Jill is a multifactorial approach that looks at physical contribution, extent of contribution, existence of duress, and the existence of malice. The defense counsel pleads that Ms. Red's act was not the causative action for Mr. Wolf's death due to her being a young lady who, due to the circumstances and pressure, was forced to act in such a way. This is wrong, Your Honours, and would be unjust of this court to rule it as such simply because of Ms. Red's young age. The defense is correct in bringing up the authority of Jack and Jill and its 4 factors. If we look at the second factor, which determines the dominant cause of the injury, in our case, although it also looks at any precursor events, we cannot deny that if Mr. Wolf only had his stomach slit open and sewed back without the rocks, he would not have died. The third factor looks at the existence of duress. Even if Britt was emotional, during the time when she placed the rocks in Mr. Wolf, the wolf was sound asleep and subsequently of no harm to her. There was no immediate pressure to make a decision, but Ms. Red consciously made the most violent choice. The fourth factor looks at malice. The defense claims that Ms. Red is innocent. She may have felt wronged by the wolf, yes, but still, this does not permit her to resort to such a violent response. In doing so, Your Honours, she has become the very villain that she is allegedly trying to escape from. We ask that this court looks at the causative test as a whole, because without Ms. Red's act of cruelty, the wolf would definitely have had a higher chance of survival. Your Honour, the second submission I will make is that the defendant, Red Riding Hood, cannot raise the defense of own fault to say that the wolf's death was more a result of his own fault than hers. This is because the defense of own fault only applies where the deceased individual's death results from an immoral act that is a necessary precondition of their death. This was shown in the case of High Witch Mouse Boy, where it was held that although the defendant boy had intentionally poisoned the witch, he could raise the defense of own fault, as it was the High Witch who had created the poison in the first place for the immoral purpose of turning the boy himself into a rat. Your Honor, in our present case, we have neither an immoral act by the wolf, nor was the wolf's own act a necessary precondition for his death. I point out that Mr. Wolf is a known carnivore, not by choice, but by nature. Hence, it should not be frowned upon that he would try to eat Red Riding Hood and her grandmother to survive. In other words, his act of eating Red Riding Hood and her grandmother is one of necessity and not immorality, which may be distinguished from High Witch and Boy, as in that case, the witch's intention to poison the boy was not a necessary act for her survival. If I may be of no further assistance, I conclude my submissions.
Thank you, prosecution. May we now invite the defense counsel back for her rebuttal submissions?
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honors, prosecution submitted that Little Red Riding Hood intended the wolf's death on the basis that she would somehow have fully appreciated that filling the wolf's stomach with rocks would certainly have killed him. However, our client Little Red Riding Hood could not and did not intend the wolf's death. Little Red Riding Hood is a mere child, a minor, and is not able to fully appreciate the consequences of all her actions. Children are naive and inexperienced. Hence, they often do things that result in drastic consequences without intending those consequences in any way. Given that she could not even tell the difference between her own grandmother and a cross-dressing wolf, it is all the more reasonable to conclude that Little Red Riding Hood could not possibly have fully appreciated the consequences of her act, and hence could not have intended to cause the wolf's death. On the own fault defense, the prosecution submitted that our client cannot raise the defense of own fault as the wolf did not commit an immoral act. However, we submit that my learned friend has misunderstood the criteria for own fault. In the case of High Witch and Mouse Boy, the chief concern of the courts was whether the initial act of the plaintiff that led to their demise was an illegal one, not whether it was an immoral one. In Fairyland, regardless of how unfair the law may seem, killing humans is clearly illegal, even for wolves. Therefore, the wolf's devouring of Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother was unquestionably illegal, which is sufficient for the defense to apply. Moreover, even if Your Honors do accept the plaintiff's reasoning that own fault requires an immoral act, we would also submit that the wolf's act was clearly an immoral one, given that it was unnecessary for him to prey on both Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother, as there is an abundance of other species in the forests of Fairyland. There are deer, rabbits, and an assortment of other game that the wolf could have easily chosen to hunt. Instead, he deliberately chose to break the law by preying on Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother. Choosing to break the law when it is unnecessary to do so is clearly immoral. Hence, the wolf cannot escape the defense of own fault, even if we apply the prosecution's criteria of immorality.
Thank you, counsel. Prosecution, your rebuttal.
Your Honors, my learned friend's reasoning that there was no intention to cause a wrongful death simply because it is an act of self-defense is erroneous. Referring to the jurisprudence, a wrongful death occurs when a person intends a bodily injury that would likely cause death. Yes, Miss Red intended to defend herself by incapacitating the wolf, but she intended to do so by placing rocks inside Mr. Wolf's belly. These rocks are huge. The placing of such large chunks of rock into the wolf's belly would render only the ultimate and most final form of incapacitation, death. Miss Red had intended to cause this injury by placing the rocks into the wolf's body, and this injury was very likely to cause death. The requirement of intention is unquestionably fulfilled. Your Honors, the own fault defense used in the case of High Witch follows the reasoning that if it was not for the witch's act of creating the potion, the boy would not have been able to turn the witch into a rat. Without the witch's act of creating the potion, none of the subsequent events would have happened. This is fundamentally distinct from our current case. Here, my client has made no such potion that would have made Miss Red's actions impossible to occur. In fact, Miss Red's decision to put the rocks into the wolf's stomach instead of using a less violent method was conceived out of her own voluntary and calculated will. It is independent of any chain of events. The defense asserts that it was the wolf's act of going after the grandmother and Ms. Ritt that caused her to react in such a way. This is simply not true and only forms a convenient excuse to excuse Ms. Ritt's voluntary decision in trying to incapacitate my client in such a cruel way. The usage of the own fault defense in such a way would go against the very purpose of the statute, which is to penalize people who have conducted illegal acts. Ms. Ritt's very actions are themselves illegal, as they plainly fulfill the statute for wrongful death. To excuse that by saying that it was the wolf's illegal act does not change the facts of the case, which are that Ms. Ritt had voluntarily and intentionally inflicted a wound that was likely to cause death and did cause death. Thank you, Your Honours.
This court thanks the defense counsel as well as the prosecution for their submissions. The court is now adjourned. Good day.